So in the waning years of the Civil War, the Confederate States were struggling to supply the men with not only food and rations, but also the basics of their uniform to keep them clothed during the war. Look no further than the cause of the Battle of Gettysburg, because they were looking for shoes. Liars! Or in the last days of Appomattox, when they had gone 3 or 4 days without a single ration, the Confederate Army was in rags toward the end of the war. Or were they? So this week with the Research Arsenal, modifying the view that the Confederate Army was in rags and ill-supplied toward the end of the war. Is that a myth? Is it true? Where did it come from? And more importantly, what did the primary records show? So one thing I love about looking at primary records is the details of the clothing ledgers that list exactly what articles of clothing or pieces of their uniform that each individual by name was issued during the war. In past videos, we've explored a few federal regiments and have looked at a couple eastern regiments and a couple western regiments. However, today we are going to explore 2 separate clothing ledgers that we've added to the Research Arsenal's database for your own research, and these are actually Confederate ledgers. These 2 regiments are the 47th Alabama Infantry and the Columbus Light Artillery. So both of these ledgers list each individual soldier by name and either what items they were issued or what items they had on hand during the muster. So let's see what these original ledgers can tell us. So first, let's look at the 47th Alabama Infantry. They were organized in eastern Alabama in May of 1862 and moved to Virginia in June. Most of its members were drawn from Chambers, Tallapoosa, Cherokee, and Coosa counties, and during the war is assigned to Law's Brigade and Perry's Brigade in the Army of Northern Virginia. The 47th Alabama fought in many battles from Cedar Mountain to Cold Harbor, except when they were with Longstreet at Chickamauga and Knoxville. It participated in the Petersburg Siege north of the James River and the final campaign at Appomattox. This regiment reported 88 casualties at Cedar Mountain, 32 casualties at 2nd Manassas, 45 casualties at Sharpsburg, 40 casualties at Gettysburg, and it lost 111 in the Wilderness. The unit surrendered in Appomattox with 17 officers and 188 men. So obviously this is a great example of a Confederate regiment that fought in mostly the Eastern Theater, so let's see what their ledger can tell us. So these 59 pages list all of the men in Company I of the 47th by name and every item issued to them. And here are some examples of what they had. Now obviously we don't have time to go through all 59 pages and every person and every time they were issued something, so I pulled out some average examples or some good examples of what most of the guys were issued. So Private Andrews was issued a new jacket, a pair of drawers, 2 pairs of shoes, 2 pairs of pants, and 2 pairs of socks in just a 6-month window of 1864. Private Baldwin was issued 3 pairs of drawers, 4 pairs of shoes, 2 shirts, 2 blankets, 2 pair of pants, and 3 pairs of socks in that same 6-month window of 1864. So now moving on to Private Bonner, he was issued 4 pairs of drawers and 3 pair of shoes, and again, 1864. Last but not least, Private Campbell Martin was issued 3 pairs of drawers, 3 pairs of pants, 3 jackets, 4 pair of shoes, and 2 shirts in that year of 1864. And what's nice is on the last page of this exact ledger, the officer actually accounts for what the cost of each item should be or was, and what the actual soldiers should have been issued, or at least the allotment allowed. And this is what he specifies. Each soldier should have received 2 jackets, 3 pair of pants, 3 shirts, 3 pairs of drawers, 4 pair of shoes, 4 pair of socks, and 1 blanket in a single year. So what does this mean? Actually, honestly, it means that the men that we just listed, which is again a representative sample of the entire company, had about what they needed. Yes, most soldiers were 1 or 2 items short of that list for a few items, and in a few cases they had more than they were allotted, like in the case of the 4 pairs of drawers for Private Bonner, 3 jackets for Private Campbell, and Private Andrews, who drew almost a year's worth of items in a 6-month window. So after that example of the 47th Alabama Infantry, let's move on to the Columbus Light Artillery, who was mustered into Confederate service at Columbus, Georgia during the early spring of 1862. Its members were from Russell and Muskogee counties, and it had about 115 men when it first served in Savannah. Later it was involved in various campaigns in Mississippi, and in November of 1863 it totaled 139 officers and men. It went on to fight in the battles for Atlanta and was with Hood in northern Georgia and Tennessee. Later on in the war, the company was given muskets and converted to infantry until the close of the war, serving in Mississippi until it surrendered in May 12th of 1865. So according to their own ledger that we of course uploaded for your own review on the Research Arsenal, they list their soldiers in a different format on a pre-printed ledger that was an actual account of the items possessed, not necessarily what was issued throughout the years. So which means this is a better snapshot of the regiment than the ongoing clothing ledgers that we have looked at before this. So the first few pages of this ledger start out by listing the number of boots and blankets to which each man had. And 90% of them had blankets, and ironically 100% of them started out with boots. Later on in 1862, the unit started moving over to shoes and boots, to which in 1862 it pretty much was 50% had shoes or brogans, or Jefferson booties, whatever you want to call them, and 50% had boots. Now, an interesting note on this specific page is that 83% of soldiers had some type of footwear, while only 16% of those soldiers had nothing listed for footwear. But ironically, there were enough other guys who actually had 2 pair of boots or 2 pair of shoes that could have outfitted all the guys who didn't have any.
Extra gloves? You've had this pair of extra gloves this whole time?
Now, what's interesting about ledgers like this, and of course this ledger goes on to list other items like shirts, drawers, socks, and on average 80% of the soldiers had what they needed, while 20% of soldiers listed on these ledgers had, or they were missing, at least 1 or more items. Finally, if we fast forward to the end of this ledger, it ends in March of 1865, pretty much as late war as you can get. So in this last entry that is actually legible, which side note, there actually is pages that show April of 1865, but the pages are so faint that you can't even make out the hash marks or the numbers. So unfortunately, I couldn't count those. I couldn't tab those up because they were just too faded. You can tell there were numbers in there, but I couldn't see the whole page. A little side note, there were pages for April of 1865, but they were just illegible at this point in time. So based on the numbers that I could actually make out in the last full month of the war, the Columbus Light Artillery still had about 80% of its men with shoes, and half in standard issue military jackets. There are other items listed like caps, trousers, and blankets, and they are definitely in lower numbers, but since many of those items are of private purchase or can be easily acquired in other ways, I had a hard time justifying choosing to include those on whether or not this regiment was properly outfitted due to having, say, issue blankets that may have not been tabbed versus a private issue blanket sent from home that they would not have, counted on the ledgers. So at least from these 2 units, one regiment that fought primarily in the East and surrendered at Appomattox, one regiment that fought primarily in the West and surrendered in May of 1865. So both regiments then were still statistically as well outfitted, at least according to their ledgers, as their federal counterparts when it comes to shoes, boots, jackets, and blankets. And for those of you saying that having 80% of your regiment still isn't great, I have to then say that those numbers are just as good as the ledgers that we find on the federal side. It's very rare to find any ledgers, ordnance returns, or anything like that that actually list in every column what every single soldier had in an entire regiment. For instance, you can look at ordnance returns and see that half of the companies in a regiment never listed anything, and other clothing ledgers in which many soldiers apparently never were issued trousers. And so, of course, that's not necessarily true. Obviously, there's not soldiers going out there running around with skivvies on or having no drawers or no pants. Obviously, they had something. So when it comes to reading these ledgers, you kind of have to read between the lines and kind of see the big picture. So what is the big picture? Well, the big picture is that the Confederate Army was not as ill-equipped or ill-uniformed as many believe. They did not have vast swaths of their columns in rags or walking barefoot. Of course, there were other regiments and other units that had it worse than these 2 regiments, and yes, I understand that looking at one Eastern unit and one Western unit is not at all a representative sample, and of course we say this in most of our videos. But the point of this is to show the value of primary records and how they can tell the story of not only the regiments, but more importantly, the soldiers that fought in them. Like Privates Andrews, Baldwin, and Bonner of the 47th Alabama, who signed these ledgers 160 years ago and are now scanned and digitized for your own research. And that is the value of these primary documents. So if you want to look at these documents yourself, please join the fastest growing Civil War research community on the internet. Our goal at the Research Arsenal is to give everyone access to documents that haven't seen the light of day in decades or maybe even a century or more. Not only do we have much of the microfilm from the National Archives that focuses on the material culture of the Civil War, but we also have collections, scans, diaries, letters, military forms, and collections and archives archives from private collections. And of course, we are so thankful for these private donors who've allowed us to digitize, upload, and transcribe them for anyone around the world to gain access to and research their favorite regiment, their favorite ancestor, or just gain a deeper understanding in the material culture of the Civil War. Let Ancestry tell you who fought in the Civil War. Let the Research Arsenal tell you how. And as a sneak peek into our next video looking at these ledgers, I don't know if you guys caught this with some of the images that we've shown in this video, but some of the inflation during the war of the prices of the goods like socks, blankets, uniforms, even caps or hats, anything like that. If you've noticed on the ledgers, the prices of these items goes sky high, and there is significant inflation of the war. So before you guys leave, I want you guys to comment down below, what do you think had more inflation, or which side do you think had more inflation when it came to soldiers paying more for their uniform items? Was it the Federal Army or was it the Confederate Army? That'll be our next video coming up. Comment below and the answer might surprise you. And if you haven't already, like us on Facebook, subscribe to our YouTube channel, click the notification bell, and until next time, happy searching.